Ready? Hi, and I'd like to thank Dr. Stanford for the warm introduction. Again, my name is Dr. Julie Kutac. I work with the Alzheimer's Association Houston and Southeast Texas chapter. I work as the professional education and research specialist. So I get to develop programs for healthcare practitioners and also work with our researchers in the medical center who are undertaking Alzheimer's research. Thank you to the Hope and Healing Center for having me today. I'm really looking forward to talking with you about something that occupies quite a lot of my thinking, which is the ethical and spiritual dimensions of dementia care. Disease. I came to it through my grandmother, Effie, who was born in 1911 and died at the age of 93 after having Alzheimer's disease for about 14 years. Of course, I say of course, but y'all don't know, but I know, we were in denial at the beginning. And so she wasn't diagnosed for 14 years, but looking back on it, we can see the memory changes starting much earlier. We told lots of stories about it, like she's depressed, she's just not quite herself. But eventually she went through all the different stages where she wandered, and then eventually she started to lose her capacities to bathe and dress herself and go to the bathroom. And then finally I was with her when she was completely unable to speak anymore, and I was with her when she passed away, which was one of the most sacred experiences of my life. She was more than just that. She was an elementary school teacher. She taught me my grammar, and she taught me my math with lots of flashcards. One of the funniest things we did was make doll clothes for my grandfather. We told him we were making him a new suit, and then the new suit was only that big. And I thought that was the funniest thing in the world. We made cookies together, and we loved each other. We loved each other very much. So while she was dying of Alzheimer's disease, I was getting my master's in philosophy of religion, and I was reading these philosophers that were talking about ethics, about the good, and why we should be good to one another, why we have moral obligations to one another. And these thinkers that I was reading were saying it's because we can think of ourselves as a self. You know, a rock doesn't say I'm a rock. We don't owe a rock what we owe to another human, because the human can say, I am a human. I am deserving of respect. I think, therefore I am, right? But my grandmother couldn't do that anymore. She couldn't think of herself as a self. And so what did I owe her? When she was in front of me and I looked at her with love, it didn't make sense to me, and I didn't have a language to talk about it, and I didn't know what to do, and it was very mysterious to be with her because she had such a hard time communicating with me. So that's what dredged up all of these questions, and that's what we're going to work on today in this presentation. So this question, who am I? It carries a huge weight of cultural desire. And who will I be when I have forgotten who I am? Who is the me? What is this idea of me? And when I can't tell you who I am and who me is, who will do that for me? Will anyone do that for me? You know, there's this weird kind of ethereal, mysterious connection between me and the me of the past and the me of the future, right? Julie, when she was 6, is different from Julie when she was 16, is different from Julie at 36, will be different from, you know, who I am when I'm 66 or 86. It's different, but it's not. But also there's some continuity. So this question isn't as easy as it seems. Well, you know, I am. So the moral question, then, the question about ethics becomes, what am I owed if I no longer recognize you, or if I no longer recognize myself? And to put it in terms of story, who will tell my story well? Because when when I can't tell you who I am, it's going to rely on others to tell you who I am. And who's going to tell my story well? I believe that this is a profoundly moral question. So just to go through a little reminder back to Philosophy 101, ethics are moral principles that govern a person or a group's behavior. It's a branch of philosophy dealing with the rightness or wrongness of actions. And kind of trailed over there. And the goodness and badness of motives and the ends of such actions. So the question is, what is the good? What is the good thing to do in a tricky, complicated situation? But I want to go even further and go back to this idea of goodness and badness of motives. I want to talk about not just what the good action is, but who are we to be? And I believe who we are to be will then inform what our actions are. This is Walter Brueggemann. He's a theologian and contemporary biblical scholarship, contemporary biblical scholar. And I like his terminology here. So he's another narrative person, and he argues that we make sense of the world through a variety of stories, which he calls scripts. It's just like the 50-cent word for it. Some of these stories are explicit, and some of them are implicit. Some stories are so implicit that they inform our world, and we don't even realize that we're doing it. Let me give you an example of a story that used to be implicit, but recently has become more explicit. A story like, fat is ugly, thin is beautiful. Right? We have new campaigns that are coming out and saying that beauty is more than skin deep, and there's a lot of different kinds of beauty, and beauty is something that's socially constructed. Right? So this is one of those stories that we didn't really used to think about, but that has become more, pronounced. Or Black lives don't matter as much as white lives. Right? This is something that we've worked really hard, a story that we've worked really hard to overcome, to say that the color of our skin is irrelevant to the content of character. So some scripts are so powerfully ingrained that we don't understand their impact. But these claims are always open to counterclaims. We're going to talk about the stories that we tell about dementia, about memory loss, and see if we can come up with stories that are richer. So first, we're going to talk about different kinds of stories. We're going to talk about medical, cultural, philosophical, psychological stories. So let's start with medical stories. Medical stories are another kind of script. A definition is a type of story, and it shapes a worldview. And the important thing about medical stories is that they allow us to move medical progress forward. This is not something that is a bad thing. I'm not saying that any of these stories are wholeheartedly bad. It's just a type of story. So what medicine and science does is that it breaks things down into the smallest components so that it can describe them well in order to control them. And when you are able to control the natural world, you can come up with therapies and drugs and therapeutics. So life gets broken down into these kinds of components for someone with dementia. It's broken down into cognitive knowledge, emotional knowledge, intellectual knowledge, and then that's broken down even further into memory, language, attention, intelligence, movement. And once we've described it really well, then we can say what is normal, what fits into these parameters that we have decided is normal. And on the other side of normal, we can look at what's not normal, what's abnormal. And we want to try and pull what's abnormal back into the normal range. Alzheimer's disease is the 6th leading cause of death. It's the only one in the top 10 for which there's no means for prevention or cure or even slowing the progress of the disease down. Research is helping us move forward so that one day I will be able to take that sentence out of the talk. But right now we can't. So Alzheimer's is inherently abnormal. And you can then talk about the typical dementia patient. But like our CEO says, if you've heard one story of someone with Alzheimer's disease, congratulations, you've heard one story of someone with Alzheimer's disease, because the disease is embodied. It's so variable. It's so variable. So there's really no such thing as a typical dementia patient. So the medical definition is reductive and fragmenting, and it talks primarily about what's lost. What are normal capacities that have then been lost? So it's automatically framing the world in a certain way in terms of loss, diminishment, and diminishment. So the biggest thing that's lost in dementia is memory. But what is memory? And there are lots of different kinds of memory. Not all forms of memory are lost with Alzheimer's disease, at least not until the latest stages of the disease. Now, semantic memory is it's really affected. That's memory of names and places, right? Facts, knowing who the president is, knowing what I wore yesterday. But there are other kinds of memories too. There are procedural memories and emotional memories. Procedural memory is that muscle memory, the reason that you can get on a bike when you haven't been on a bike for 20 years, or how you can type without having to look down at the keyboard, muscle memory. That is preserved until much later in the disease process. So you can verbally cue someone with Alzheimer's, and they may not fully understand what they're doing, but the fork will go, towards the mouth. Emotional memory is also preserved. So a person with Alzheimer's disease can feel shame and embarrassment. They can also feel contentment and success and joy. That's a kind of memory too. They also may not remember the name of that song, but they can remember being, on the seawall when they were 17 years old on a trip to Galveston, and that song was playing and how that song made them feel. They can still call up that memory. Memory is also constructed and reconstructed. It's saturated with emotion. I can stand up here and tell you that I was present with my grandmother when she took her last breath, but I can only do that because I've put that memory out, I've taken it back in, I've interpreted it, I've had 15 years of, being able to think about it, I've pulled in other stories, and so memory is it's not just a computer, where you recall things. So just saying that someone with dementia loses memory doesn't really get to the whole story of what it's like to live with Alzheimer's disease. Then there are cultural stories, the kinds of stories that swirl around us, that impact the way that we engage with someone with Alzheimer's disease. Have y'all heard any of these? I wish that I could say that I just made them up, but this was said by a pastor to a lady, it was on TV, to a lady who called in and said, I don't know what to do. My husband of, so many years, 50 years, 60 years, has Alzheimer's disease, and I feel like he's already dead. To which he said, well, the person you married is gone, so I wouldn't guilt trip you for divorcing him. This is a very tragic story, a tragedy on any level, of a family in Scotland where the husband suffocated his wife who had advanced dementia. He was arrested and put on trial. And I mean, that man will suffer for the rest of his life. But he was released on the grounds that she was not the woman he married, that the woman he married was gone and it was a shell that was left. So these stories are around the demented, not a person with dementia. They're just completely reduced to their dementia. The demented waste resources, their burdens. Even if you yourself don't tell those stories, these are stories that are with us and that are informing us. And what John Swinton says is that this causes a kind of linguistic annihilation, where we use our words to effectively kill the person who's there. And then who's left? What is left is just a shell. So these are more stories. Then there's the way, going back to when I was at school and reading the philosophers, there are philosophical stories, scripts about dementia. And so here's the thing. The Enlightenment happened after the Renaissance. And what happened in the Renaissance was that all of a sudden, truly for the first time, we started considering ourselves as microcosms of the heavens that were above us. And this was a miracle. This was just a truly magical awakening, that we were greater than animals, less than gods, but we were like gods in the sense that we could ponder both things. We could go inside or we could go outside. This affected a whole line of philosophical thinking. And autonomy emerged as one of the primary moral concepts, this capacity for self-determination and self-governance. It mattered so much we built a country on it, right? This idea that we could start the United States and we could do it ourselves. We could, and then manifest destiny, move west, settle, do it ourselves. Autonomy, it's a very important concept. Personhood becomes huge in this, in this concept, in this idea of what is autonomous and what does it mean? Because it's only a person who has a claim to moral obligations. So defining who a person is becomes really important. Now, this is just the tiniest sampling of the way that some philosophers think about autonomy. So John Locke, right in the height of the Enlightenment, said that a person is a being who can think of himself as a self. He has capacities for self-governance. So that means that anybody who can't think of themselves as a self is not a person, and we don't owe them anything. We don't have to care about them or care for them. So my grandmother in this scenario is out. John Harris refines it a little bit. He's a 20th century philosopher. He says that a person is someone who can value his or her own life. So moral obligation waxes and wanes across the life, across the lifespan, where adults are more valuable than children. But I can't value my own life when I'm asleep. So does that mean that personhood goes away when I'm sleeping? Or maybe, and if I can't value my own life, then because I have dementia, I'm not a person anymore? Peter Singer says that he goes even further and says that only people have a right to life. Only persons have a right to life. But these stories are reflecting the values of these people. And what do philosophers do? They sit and they think. That's their job. So of course they're going to value the most highly sitting and thinking. Because that's what's valuable to them. Now, Peter Singer's mother, Cora, developed Alzheimer's disease. So based on his philosophy, he would let her die. She's a waste, resources that could be used elsewhere. He came up with lots of excuses why his mother should still be cared for. So it turns out that pragmatic logic and love are not easy bedfellows. That when you're close to someone, it becomes much more difficult to say that their personhood has been lost or that they're nothing. So it brings us to this idea of the hermeneutics of distance. We can stay someone far away, we don't really owe them anything. But when it's someone that we love and someone who's up close, it becomes something very different. I also want to talk about thinking. The behavior and speech aren't even necessarily good indicators of thought. Right? I can stand here and I'm talking, I don't really know what I'm thinking about. Like maybe I'm talking, but I'm also thinking about how good that salad looks. And I can look at y'all and you can, I spent enough time in school to know that you can nod and smile and you can be thinking about something totally different, but look like you're paying attention. All I'm saying is that I can't know what you're thinking. Mind reading has not come along as quickly as we would like it to. So when someone with Alzheimer's disease isn't talking, we say there's nothing there, but we don't really know. Because if they don't talk, the only way that their thoughts are communicated to us is through communication, through their ability to put it into words or gestures or actions. Just a sidebar, what communicates more to folks with Alzheimer's disease? Body language or what you say? Body language. Body language. Again, it becomes a moral question. Who are you to be? What kind of presence are you to be? I'll tell you another story about my grandmother. I'm so sorry. So we were in the hospital. She had another bladder infection. She was laying in bed. She was pretty nonverbal at this point. The doctor was standing over her bed. My grandmother was laying down. My mother, only child, my mother was standing on the other side of the bed. And the doctor was given that medical script of dementia, telling her all the things that she'd lost and she'd never be able to do again. And my grandmother wasn't really talking anymore, so she couldn't chime in. But my mom had the presence of mind to look down, and my grandmother's eyes were huge and tears were streaming down her face. So even though she didn't talk, she knew in that moment. Now maybe the blessing, the tiny blessing, is that she would forget in a short amount of time. But in that moment, moral harm was done to her. We don't want to harm the ones that we care about. So behaviors and speech are not necessarily good indicators of thought. And those who are closest to us often matter more than those who are far away. Now, whether that's right or wrong, we can talk about. But there's, a reason that maybe those who are halfway around the world it's hard to get a handle on that. But when that dog looks at us with Sarah McLachlan singing in the pet commercial, with that, it's so hard not to pick up the phone and give them money right then because that dog looks so sad. Okay, so now let's go on and talk about some other stories of dementia. So the psychologists talk about 3 different aspects of self. This is getting back to that question of who the me is. First, there's personal identity, myself in the present. Yes, ma'am.
When you're talking about me, you're talking about the Alzheimer's patient.
Yeah, or anyone. Yeah, anyone right now. This is just a general idea of how we talk, ideas about self. So the self in the present stays pretty static over time. That's the Julie who's 6 and the Julie who's 16 still feels like Julie. I still feel like me. So that stays. We don't know how that's affected in Alzheimer's disease. People say, I feel like I'm losing myself. We don't really know exactly what that means. Then there's the second self, physical characteristics and biography. These are things that develop, but then once you have them, they don't go away. So I am never going to get any taller. I've hit my max height, and I'm stuck here. I can put on heels, but I can't affect it that much. I'll just disappear if that happens. I don't have anywhere to go. Weight, a little more fluctuates, but is generally about the same. Sense of humor, I still think that Seinfeld is really funny. I thought Seinfeld was funny 20 years ago. I still think it is. Once I graduate college, I will always be known as a college grad. What happens, though, when you're diagnosed with a terminal disease like dementia? Now, I'm not just Julie, I'm Julie with Alzheimer's. And I would argue that this part of the self crowds out other ideas about the self. And then finally, there's the self 3, the personae that we construct. And you can never have that identity without someone else to reflect upon it. Like, I can never be a teacher without students. I can't be a mother without a child. I can't be a friend if I'm all by myself, unless I'm, being a friend of myself. But those are always aspects of the self that are in relationship. So we get back to this idea of losing the self. What is it that's being lost? Maybe it's not the first self. That sense of me is still there. I'm still here. Glenn Campbell says that in his song. Or in that's the title of the documentary, I'm Still Here. But he's Glenn with dementia. So the title for this is Malignant Social Positioning, where we position someone as inferior because of some aspect of their identity that crowds out other aspects of their identity. And, one of the things, so when I was in school, I studied suffering. And one of the biggest characteristics of suffering is isolation. What is more isolating than having communication challenges that make it hard for you to express your thoughts? And here, I'll argue that every terminal disease can create that kind of isolation. Tell me, what can I do to help? Well, you just let me know. And then they go, away because people don't know what to say. Or they look at someone with Alzheimer's and think, oh my goodness, I will die too one day. hard. It's hard to look into that, to see that. So we turn away. We isolate. And so maybe losing the self is losing that relational component, feeling like those relationships are gone. So, well, this has been depressing. All of these stories are about loss, 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 loss of self, loss of mind, loss of memory, loss of capacities, loss of personhood. Let's talk about dementia in terms of what remains. In redescribing dementia, I would say that dementia is as relational as it is social. It's relational and social as it is neurological. And it's a radical move to think about this in a new way. So Tom Kitwood starts doing a really good job of getting us closer to that. He says that personhood is based on relationships. As long as you are in relation to another person, then you are a person and you are owed, you have moral obligations that you are owed. But he doesn't quite get there because, again, we've talked about this malignant social positioning. We've talked about losing the self. We've talked about people going away and not coming back. So what happens to the person who has to go through the court system for guardianship? Like my grandmother, who just about outlived everyone who loved her. I say that. She still had quite a lot of people at her funeral, because it turns out lives have a lot of rippling effect. But what happens to those people who are so radically isolated? So we can do even better. So let's just get rid of the idea of persons. Let's re-narrate personhood. Let's say that being a person is prior to any capacity, anything that we can do, that it's situated in the very beingness of being human. It's situated within the life of the human being. That it's biological and genealogical and not based on something that we can do. Then we need to ask, so what are the characteristics of being a human being? If we're going to say that being a person is being a human being, what does it mean to be a human being? Say, first of all, humans are dependent on one another. The notion of autonomy it's a good idea, but it's not the only idea. And in fact, we are radically dependent on each other, and we're contingent. We are all one step away from the diagnosis, from the car accident, from the reversal of fortune. We are very lucky. And fortune, it's always there. Our lives are contingent. We also live in bodies. You know, in the Bible, right, God, we're this combination of flesh and spirit. So we are in bodies, and we're in bodies that break down. As much as we would like to deny that fact, we're all breaking, we're breaking down. And we're reminded of that as we age. We're reminded powerfully of that as we age. We're relational. We're dependent on each other, but we're also relational. We're born into relationships. We are never alone in the sense that, as we're born into a mother's arms. So we're always relational. And none of us get to where we are without the help of many, many other people. And then finally, we're purposeful. We are here to do work in the world, even if that work is to be in relation with others, even if that work is to be dependent on another. That is a purpose. We are profoundly purposeful. So what then is the purpose of the person with dementia? I don't know if there's one particular answer to that. But I'd say that we have to move past just the idea of neurology in thinking about memory and think about it as one human soul to another human soul.
Is that supposed to be the sex part?
Yeah. So two souls who are connecting. And that's a mysterious process. Now, I would argue that's a spiritual process where you open yourself up to the person with dementia, to the person with memory loss, and allow them in a way that's informed by the Spirit to minister to you. So in this way, the idea of caring, of being in relation, becomes an ethical act in itself. The love, the attention, the tenderness that you show to someone with Alzheimer's or dementia, if done with purpose and if done with intention, is a moral act. In doing this, we tell the story of the person with dementia. We put them together. We remember them. We remember them right now in our presence, in our being with the person with dementia. It's a willful and intentional statement that looks at the person and says, "It is good that you exist. It is good that you are in the world." It may even be a radical act to say that to someone who has been linguistically annihilated by others. To make that defiant claim, "You are a human, you are worthy of my love." So when we went to visit my grandmother in the later stages of the disease, she couldn't talk to us. But folks with Alzheimer's at that stage still interact with the world through tactile sensation, through their senses. And we didn't just look upon her as a demented, someone with dementia. She was Effie. She was my grandmother. Her age spots and her hands and her smell and her warmth told us a different story. They told us a story of value and of love and companionship and purpose. It may still remain mysterious to us, and I'm not gonna sugarcoat it and say that the disease isn't terribly difficult. But I do believe that small gestures can reveal great truths. So this work is based on the book Dementia, Living in the Memories of God by John Swinton, who's a theologian out of Scotland. And so if you are looking for some summer reading, then I really highly recommend this book. Yeah, sure. Yes. And I do want to say that the Alzheimer's Association is here to help. Our reason for being in the world is to help families and individuals with dementia. We have a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week helpline. That's 800-272-3900. We've talked about ways of being and ways of being with, but that doesn't answer the question of how you get your loved one to get in the bath. Call this number. You can call it at 2 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day, and there will be someone there to answer it in 140 different languages even. We also have a really fantastic website. I've worked with the association for almost 3 years, and 2.5 years, and I still haven't seen everything that's on the website. We do education and community, like out in the community, like the one I'm doing today. But we also have 50 support groups across the 37 counties that we service. So actually, right now, as we're speaking, the men's support group is meeting at the association. I like to tell people to date around when it comes to support groups. Find the one that resonates with you, the one whose dynamic best fits your needs. But please, do go and meet others who are walking similar paths. We have a registered nurse on staff who performs care consultations, where she'll provide supportive listening and individualized planning and problem solving based on a family's particular needs. And no family is ever turned away, regardless of their ability to pay. The Alzheimer's Association is the largest private funder of Alzheimer's research in the world, which is interesting, but it's the third largest funder of Alzheimer's research in the world, period, after the NIH and China, the Chinese government. So we've funded over $315 million since 1982, and we're currently funding almost $1 million in the medical center alone.